Chapter 5 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gabriel Lambrick. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8. Cemeteries take that which has committed them. Chapter 5. It is not necessary to be drunk in order to be immortal. On the following day, as the sun was declining, the very rare passers-by on the Boulevard du Maine pulled off their hats to an old-fashioned hearse, ornamented with skulls, crossbones, and tears. This hearse contained a coffin, covered with a white cloth, over which spread a large black cross, like a huge corpse with drooping arms. A mourning coach, in which could be seen a priest in his surplice and a choir boy in his red cap, followed. Two undertakers' men in grey uniforms trimmed with black walked on the right and the left of the hearse. Behind it came an old man in the garments of a labourer, who limped along. The procession was going in the direction of the Vaugirard cemetery. The handle of a hammer, the blade of a cold chisel, and the antennae of a pair of pincers were visible, protruding from the man's pocket. The Vaugirard cemetery formed an exception among the cemeteries of Paris. It had its peculiar usages, just as it had its carriage entrance and its house door, which old people in the quarter, who clung tenaciously to ancient words, still called the Porte Cavalière and the Porte Piétonne. The Bernardine Benedictine of the Rue Petit Picpus had obtained permission, as we have already stated, to be buried there in a corner apart and at night, the plot of land having formerly belonged to their community. The grave-diggers being thus bound to service in the evening in summer and at night in winter in this cemetery, they were subjected to a special discipline. The gates of the Paris cemeteries closed, at that epoch, at sundown, and this being a municipal regulation, the Vaugirard cemetery was bound by it like the rest. The carriage gate and the house door were two contiguous grated gates, adjoining a pavilion built by the architect Perronnet, and inhabited by the doorkeeper of the cemetery. These gates, therefore, swung inexorably on their hinges at the instant when the sun disappeared behind the dome of the Invalides. If any gravedigger were delayed after that moment in the cemetery, there was but one way for him to get out: his gravedigger's card, furnished by the Department of Public Funerals. A sort of letterbox was constructed in the porter's window. The gravedigger dropped his card into this box, the porter heard it fall, pulled the rope, and the small door opened. If the man had not his card, he mentioned his name. The porter, who was sometimes in bed and asleep, rose, came out, and identified the man, and opened the gate with his key. The gravedigger stepped out, but had to pay a fine of 15 francs. This cemetery, with its peculiarities outside the regulations, embarrassed the symmetry of the administration. It was suppressed a little later than 1830. The cemetery of Montparnasse, called the Eastern Cemetery, succeeded to it, and inherited that famous dram-shop next to the Vaugirard cemetery, which was surmounted by a quince painted on a board, and which formed an angle, one side on the drinkers' tables, and the other on the tombs, with this sign, Au bon coin. The Vaugirard cemetery was what may be called a faded cemetery. It was falling into disuse. Dampness was invading it. The flowers were deserting it. The bourgeois did not care much about being buried in the Vaugirard. It hinted at poverty. Père Lachaise, if you please. To be buried in Père Lachaise is equivalent to having furniture of mahogany. It is recognized as elegant. The Vaugirard cemetery was a venerable enclosure, planted like an old-fashioned French garden. Straight alleys, box, thuya trees, holly, ancient tombs beneath aged cypress trees, and very tall grass. In the evening it was tragic there. There were very lugubrious lines about it. The sun had not yet set when the hearse with the white pall and the black cross entered the avenue of the Vaugirard cemetery. The lame man who followed it was no other than Fauchelevent. The interment of Mother Crucifixion in the vault under the altar, the exit of Cosette, the introduction of Jean Valjean into the dead room, all had been executed without difficulty, and there had been no hitch. Let us remark in passing that the burial of Mother Crucifixion under the altar of the convent is a perfectly venial offence in our sight. It is one of the faults which resemble a duty. The nuns had committed it not only without difficulty, but even with the applause of their own consciences. In the cloister, what is called the government is only an intermeddling with authority, an interference which is always questionable. In the first place, the rule. As for the code, we shall see. Make as many laws as you please, men, but keep them for yourselves. The tribute to Caesar is never anything but the remnants of the tribute to God. A prince is nothing in the presence of a principle. Fauchelevent limped along behind the hearse in a very contented frame of mind. His twin plots, the one with the nuns, the one for the convent, the other against it, the other with Monsieur Madeleine, had succeeded, to all appearance. Jean Valjean's composure was one of those powerful tranquillities which are contagious. Fauchelevent no longer felt doubtful as to his success. What remained to be done was a mere nothing. Within the last 2 years he had made good Father Mestienne a chubby-cheeked person, drunk at least 10 times. He played with Father Mestienne. He did what he liked with him. He made him dance according to his whim. Mestienne's head adjusted itself to the cap of Fauchelevent's will. Fauchelevent's confidence was perfect. At the moment when the convoy entered the avenue leading to the cemetery, Fauchelevent glanced cheerfully at the hearse, and said half aloud, as he rubbed his big hands, "Here's a fine farce." All at once the hearse halted. It had reached the gate. The permission for interment must be exhibited. The undertaker's man addressed himself to the porter of the cemetery. During this colloquy, which always is productive of a delay of from 1 to 2 minutes, someone, a stranger, came and placed himself behind the hearse, beside Fauchelevent. He was a sort of labouring man, who wore a waistcoat with large pockets, and carried a mattock under his arm. Fauchelevent surveyed this stranger. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man replied, "The grave digger." If a man could survive the blow of a cannon-ball full in the breast, he would make the same face that Fauchelevent made. "The grave digger?" "Yes." "You?" "I." "Father Mestienne is the grave digger?" "He was." "What? He was?" "He is dead." Fauchelevent had expected anything but this, that a grave digger could die. It is true, nevertheless, that grave diggers do die themselves. By dint of excavating graves for other people, one hollows out one's own. Fauchelevent stood there with his mouth wide open. He had hardly the strength to stammer, "But it is not possible." "It is so." "But," he persisted feebly, "Father Mestienne is the grave digger." "After Napoleon, Louis XVIII. After Mestienne, Gribier. Peasant, my name is Gribier." Fauchelevent, who was deadly pale, stared at this Gribier. He was a tall, thin, livid, utterly funereal man. He had the air of an unsuccessful doctor who had turned grave-digger. Fauchelevent burst out laughing. "Ah," said he, "what queer things do happen! Father Mestienne is dead, but long live little Father Lenoir. Do you know who little Father Lenoir is? He is a jug of red wine. It is a jug of Suresnes Morbigoux, of real Paris Suresnes. Ah, so old Mestienne is dead. I'm sorry for it. He was a jolly fellow. But you are a jolly fellow too. Are you not, comrade? We'll go and have a drink together presently." The man replied, "I have been a student. I passed my 4th examination. I never drink." The hearse had set out again, and was rolling up the grand alley of the cemetery. Fauchelevent had slackened his pace. He limped more out of anxiety than from infirmity. The gravedigger walked on in front of him. Fauchelevent passed the unexpected Gribier once more in review. He was one of those men who, though very young, have the air of age, and who, though slender, are extremely strong. "Comrade!" cried Fauchelevent. The man turned round. "I am the convent gravedigger." "My colleague," said the man. Fauchelevent, who was illiterate but very sharp, understood that he had to deal with a formidable species of man, with a fine talker. He muttered, "So, Father Mestienne is dead." The man replied, "Completely. The good God consulted his notebook, which shows when the time is up. It was Father Mestienne's turn. Father Mestienne died." Fauchelevent repeated mechanically, "The good God, the good God," said the man authoritatively. "According to the philosophers, the eternal Father. According to the Jacobins, the Supreme Being." "Shall we not make each other's acquaintance?" stammered Fauchelevent. "It is made. You are a peasant. I am a Parisian." "Oh, people do not know each other until they have drunk together. He who empties his glass empties his heart. You must come and have a drink with me. Such a thing cannot be refused." "Business first." Fauchelevent thought, "I am lost." They were only a few turns of the wheel distant from the small alley leading to the nuns' corner. The gravedigger resumed, "Peasant, I have 7 small children who must be fed. As they must eat, I cannot drink." And he added, with the satisfaction of a serious man who is turning a phrase well, "Their hunger is the enemy of my thirst." The hearse skirted a clump of cypress trees, quitted the grand alley, turned into a narrow one, entered the wasteland, and plunged into a thicket. This indicated the immediate proximity of the place of sepulture. Fauchelevent slackened his pace, but he could not detain the hearse. Fortunately, the soil, which was light and wet with the winter rains, clogged the wheels and retarded its speed. He approached the gravedigger. "They have such a nice little Argenteuil wine," murmured Fauchelevent. "Villager!" retorted the man. "I ought not to be a gravedigger. My father was a porter at the Prytaneum (town hall). He destined me for literature, but he had reverses, he had losses on 'Change. I was obliged to renounce the profession of author. But I am still a public writer." "So you are not a gravedigger, then?" returned Fauchelevent, clutching at this branch, feeble as it was. "The one does not hinder the other. I accumulate." Fauchelevent did not understand this last word. "Come have a drink," said he. Here a remark becomes necessary. Fauchelevent, whatever his anguish, offered a drink, but he did not explain himself on one point: who was to pay? Generally, Fauchelevent offered, and Father Mestienne paid. An offer of a drink was the evident result of the novel situation created by the new gravedigger, and it was necessary to make this offer. But the old gardener left the proverbial quarter of an hour named after Rabelais in the dark, and that not unintentionally. As for himself, Fauchelevent did not wish to pay, troubled as he was. The gravedigger went on with a superior smile. "One must eat. I have accepted Father Mestienne's reversion. One gets to be a philosopher when one has nearly completed his classes. To the labour of the hand I join the labour of the arm. I have my scrivener's stall in the market of the Rue de Sèvres. You know, the umbrella market. All the cooks of the Red Cross apply to me. I scribble their declarations of love to the raw soldiers. In the morning I write love letters. In the evening I dig graves. Such is life, rustic." The hearse was still advancing. Fauchelevent, uneasy to the last degree, was gazing about him on all sides. Great drops of perspiration trickled down from his brow. "But," continued the grave digger, "a man cannot serve two mistresses. I must choose between the pen and the mattock. The mattock is ruining my hand." The hearse halted. The choir-boy alighted from the mourning coach, then the priest. One of the small front wheels of the hearse had run up a little on a pile of earth, beyond which an open grave was visible. "What a farce this is!" repeated Fauchelevent in consternation. End of Book 8, Chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8. Cemeteries take that which is committed them. Chapter 6. Between four planks. Who was in the coffin? The reader knows. Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean had arranged things so that he could exist there, and he could almost breathe. It is a strange thing to what a degree security of conscience confers security of the rest. Every combination thought out by Jean Valjean had been progressing, and progressing favourably, since the preceding day. He, like Fauchelevent, counted on Father Mestienne. He had no doubt as to the end. Never was there a more critical situation, never more complete composure. The four planks of the coffin breathe out a kind of terrible peace. It seemed as though something of the repose of the dead entered into Jean Valjean's tranquillity. From the depths of that coffin he had been able to follow, and he had followed, all the phases of the terrible drama which he was playing with death. Shortly after Fauchelevent had finished nailing on the upper plank, Jean Valjean had felt himself carried out, then driven off. He knew, from the diminution in the jolting, when they left the pavements and reached the earth road. He had divined, from a dull noise, that they were crossing the bridge of Austerlitz. At the first halt, he had understood that they were entering the cemetery. At the second halt, he said to himself, "Here is the grave." Suddenly he felt hands seize the coffin, then a harsh grating against the planks. He explained it to himself as the rope which was being fastened round the casket in order to lower it into the cavity. Then he experienced a giddiness. The undertaker's man and the grave digger had probably allowed the coffin to lose its balance, and had lowered the head before the foot. He recovered himself fully when he felt himself horizontal and motionless. He had just touched the bottom. He had a certain sensation of cold. A voice rose above him, glacial and solemn. He heard Latin words which he did not understand pass over him so slowly that he was able to catch them one by one. Qui dormiunt in terrae pulvere, e vigilabunt, alii in vitam aeternam, et alii in opprobrium, ut videant semper. A child's voice said, De profundis. The grave voice began again, Requiem aeternam dona ei, Domine. The child's voice responded, Et lux perpetua luceat ei. He heard something like the gentle patter of several drops of rain on the plank which covered him. It was probably the holy water. He thought, this will be over soon now. Patience for a little while longer. The priest will take his departure. Fauchelevent will take Mestienne off to drink. I shall be left. Then Fauchelevent will return alone, and I shall get out. That will be the work of a good hour." The grave voice resumed, "Requiescat in pace." And the child's voice said, "Amen." Jean Valjean strained his ears and heard something like retreating footsteps. "There, they are going now," thought he. "I am alone." All at once he heard over his head a sound which seemed to him to be a clap of thunder. It was a shovelful of earth falling on the coffin. A second shovelful fell. One of the holes through which he breathed had just been stopped up. A third shovelful of earth fell. Then a fourth. There are things which are too strong for the strongest man. Jean Valjean lost consciousness. End of Book 8, Chapter 6. Recording by Ruth Golding. Chapter 7 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8. Cemeteries take that which is committed them. Chapter 7, in which will be found the origin of the saying, "Don't lose the card." This is what had taken place above the coffin in which lay Jean Valjean. When the hearse had driven off, when the priest and the choir boy had entered the carriage again and taken their departure, Fauchelevent, who had not taken his eyes from the gravedigger, saw the latter bend over and grasp his shovel, which was sticking upright in the heap of dirt. Then Fauchelevent took a supreme resolve. He placed himself between the grave and the gravedigger, crossed his arms, and said, "I am the one to pay." The gravedigger stared at him in amazement, and replied, "What's that, peasant?" Fauchelevent repeated, "I am the one who pays." "What?" "For the wine." "What wine?" "That Argenteuil wine." "Where is the Argenteuil?" "At the Bon Coing." "Go to the devil," said the gravedigger. And he flung a shovelful of earth on the coffin. The coffin gave back a hollow sound. Fauchelevent felt himself stagger and on the point of falling headlong into the grave himself. He shouted in a voice in which the strangling sound of the death rattle began to mingle, "Comrade, before the Bon Coing is shut!" The gravedigger took some more earth on his shovel. Fauchelevent continued, "I will pay." And he seized the man's arm. "Listen to me, comrade. I am the convent gravedigger. I have come to help you. It is a business which can be performed at night. Let us begin, then, by going for a drink." And as he spoke and clung to this desperate insistence, this melancholy reflection occurred to him: "And if he drinks, will he get drunk?" "Provincial," said the man, "if you positively insist upon it, I consent. We will drink after work, never before." And he flourished his shovel briskly. Fauchelevent held him back. "It is Argenteuil wine at 6." "Oh, come," said the gravedigger, "you are a bell ringer. Ding dong, ding dong. That's all you know how to say. Go hang yourself." And he threw in a second shovelful. Fauchelevent had reached a point where he no longer knew what he was saying. "Come along and drink," he cried, "since it is I who pays the bill." "When we have put the child to bed," said the gravedigger. He flung in a third shovelful. Then he thrust his shovel into the earth, and added, "It's cold to-night, you see, and the corpse would shriek out after us if we were to plant her there without a coverlet." At that moment, as he loaded his shovel, the grave digger bent over, and the pocket of his waistcoat gaped. Fauchelevent's wild gaze fell mechanically into that pocket, and there it stopped. The sun was not yet hidden behind the horizon. There was still light enough to enable him to distinguish something white at the bottom of that yawning pocket. The sum total of lightning that the eye of a Picard peasant can contain traversed Fauchelevent's pupils. An idea had just occurred to him. He thrust his hand into the pocket from behind, without the grave digger, who was wholly absorbed in his shovelful of earth, observing it, and pulled out the white object which lay at the bottom of it. The man sent a fourth shovelful tumbling into the grave. Just as he turned round to get the fifth, Fauchelevent looked calmly at him and said, "By the way, you new man, have you your card?" The grave digger paused. "What card?" "The sun is on the point of setting." "That's good. It's going to put on its nightcap." "The gate of the cemetery will close immediately." "Well, what then?" "Have you your card?" "Ah, my card," said the grave digger, and he fumbled in his pocket. Having searched one pocket, he proceeded to search the other. He passed on to his fobs, explored the first, returned to the second. "Why, no," said he, "I have not my card. I must have forgotten it." 15 francs fine," said Fauchelevent. The grave digger turned green. Green is the pallor of livid people. "Ah, Jésus, mon Dieu, bancroche à bas la lune!" he exclaimed. 15 francs fine!" 3 pieces of 100 sous," said Fauchelevent. The grave digger dropped his shovel. Fauchelevent's turn had come. "Ah, come now, conscript," said Fauchelevent, "none of this despair. There is no question of committing suicide and benefiting the grave. 15 francs is 15 francs. And besides, you may not be able to pay it. I am an old hand, you are a new one. I know all the ropes and the devices. I will give you some friendly advice. One thing is clear, the sun is on the point of setting. It is touching the dome now. The cemetery will be closed in 5 minutes more." "That is true," replied the man. 5 minutes more, and you will not have time to fill the grave, it is as hollow as the devil, this grave, and to reach the gate in season to pass it before it is shut. "That is true." "In that case, a fine of 15 francs." 15 francs! But you have time. Where do you live?" "A couple of steps from the barrier, a quarter of an hour from here. Number 87, Rue du Vaugirard." "You have just time to get out by taking to your heels at your best speed." "That is exactly so." "Once outside the gate, you gallop home, you get your card, you return, the cemetery porter admits you. As you have your card, there will be nothing to pay, and you will bury your corpse. I'll watch it for you in the meantime, so that it shall not run away." "I am indebted to you for my life, peasant." "Decamp," said Fauchelevent. The grave digger, overwhelmed with gratitude, shook his hand, and set off on a run. When the man had disappeared in the thicket, Fauchelevent listened until he heard his footsteps die away in the distance. Then he leaned over the grave and said in a low tone, "Father Madeleine." There was no reply. Fauchelevent was seized with a shudder. He tumbled rather than climbed into the grave, flung himself on the head of the coffin, and cried, "Are you there?" Silence in the coffin. Fauchelevent, hardly able to draw his breath for trembling, seized his cold chisel and his hammer and pried up the coffin lid. Jean Valjean's face appeared in the twilight. It was pale, and his eyes were closed. Fauchelevent's hair rose upright on his head. He sprang to his feet, then fell back against the side of the grave, ready to swoon on the coffin. He stared at Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean lay there, pallid and motionless. Fauchelevent murmured in a voice as faint as a sigh, "He is dead." And drawing himself up, and folding his arms with such violence that his clenched fists came in contact with his shoulders, he cried, "And this is the way I save his life!" Then the poor man fell to sobbing. He soliloquized the while, for it is an error to suppose that the soliloquy is unnatural. Powerful emotion often talks aloud. "It is Father Mestienne's fault. Why did that fool die? What need was there for him to give up the ghost at the very moment when no one was expecting it? It is he who has killed Monsieur Madeleine. Father Madeleine, he is in the coffin. It is quite handy. All is over. Now, is there any sense in these things? Ah, my God, he is dead. Well, and his little girl, what am I to do with her? What will the fruit seller say? The idea of its being possible for a man like that to die like this! When I think how he put himself under that cart! Father Madeleine, Pardine! He was suffocated. I said so. He wouldn't believe me. Well, here's a pretty trick to play. He is dead, that good man. The very best man out of all the good God's good folks. And his little girl. Ah! In the first place, I won't go back there myself. I shall stay here. After having done such a thing as that. What's the use of being two old men if we are two old fools? But in the first place, how did he manage to enter the convent? That was the beginning of it all. One should not do such things. Father Madeleine, Father Madeleine, Father Madeleine, Madeleine, Monsieur Madeleine, Monsieur le Maire. He does not hear me. Now get out of this scrape if you can. And he tore his hair. A grating sound became audible through the trees in the distance. It was the cemetery gate closing. Fauchelevent bent over Jean Valjean. And all at once he bounded back and recoiled so far as the limits of a grave permit. Jean Valjean's eyes were open and gazing at him. To see a corpse is alarming. To behold a resurrection is almost as much so. Fauchelevent became like stone, pale, haggard, overwhelmed by all these excesses of emotion, not knowing whether he had to do with a living man or a dead one, and staring at Jean Valjean, who was gazing at him. "I fell asleep," said Jean Valjean, and he raised himself to a sitting posture. Fauchelevent fell on his knees. "Just good Virgin, how you frightened me!" Then he sprang to his feet and cried, "Thanks, Father Madeleine." Jean Valjean had merely fainted. The fresh air had revived him. Joy is the ebb of terror. Fauchelevent found almost as much difficulty in recovering himself as Jean Valjean had. "So you are not dead! Oh, how wise you are! I called you so much that you came back. When I saw your eyes shut, I said, 'Good, there he is, stifled.' I should have gone raving mad, mad enough for a strait-jacket. They would have put me in Bicêtre. What do you suppose I should have done if you had been dead? And your little girl, there's that fruit seller, she would never have understood it. The child is thrust into your arms, and then the grandfather is dead. What a story! Good saints of paradise, what a tale! Oh, you are alive, that's the best of it." "I am cold," said Jean Valjean. This remark recalled Fauchelevent thoroughly to reality, and there was pressing need of it. The souls of these two men were troubled even when they had recovered themselves, although they did not realize it, and there was about them something uncanny, which was the sinister bewilderment inspired by the place. "Let us get out of here quickly!" exclaimed Fauchelevent. He fumbled in his pocket, and pulled out a gourd with which he had provided himself. "But first take a drop," said he. The flask finished what the fresh air had begun. Jean Valjean swallowed a mouthful of brandy, and regained full possession of his faculties. He got out of the coffin, and helped Fauchelevent to nail on the lid again. 3 minutes later they were out of the grave. Moreover, Fauchelevent was perfectly composed. He took his time. The cemetery was closed. The arrival of the grave digger Gribier was not to be apprehended. That conscript was at home, busily engaged in looking for his card, and at some difficulty in finding it in his lodgings, since it was in Fauchelevent's pocket. Without a card, he could not get back into the cemetery. Fauchelevent took the shovel, and Jean Valjean the pickaxe, and together they buried the empty coffin. When the grave was full, Fauchelevent said to Jean Valjean, "Let us go. I will keep the shovel. Do you carry off the mattock." Night was falling. Jean Valjean experienced some difficulty in moving and in walking. He had stiffened himself in that coffin, and had become a little like a corpse. The rigidity of death had seized upon him between those 4 planks. He had, in a manner, to thaw out from the tomb. "You are benumbed," said Fauchelevent. "It is a pity that I have a game leg, for otherwise we might step out briskly." "Bah!" replied Jean Valjean. 4 paces will put life into my legs once more." They set off by the alleys through which the hearse had passed. On arriving before the closed gate and the porter's pavilion, Fauchelevent, who held the grave digger's card in his hand, dropped it into the box. The porter pulled the rope. The gate opened, and they went out. "How well everything is going!" said Fauchelevent. "What a capital idea that was of yours, Father Madeleine." They passed the Vaugirard barrier in the simplest manner in the world. In the neighbourhood of the cemetery, a shovel and pick are equal to 2 passports. The Rue Vaugirard was deserted. "Father Madeleine," said Fauchelevent as they went along, and raising his eyes to the houses, "your eyes are better than mine. Show me number 87." "Here it is," said Jean Valjean. "There is no one in the street," said Fauchelevent. "Give me your mattock, and wait a couple of minutes for me." Fauchelevent entered number 87, ascended to the very top, guided by the instinct which always leads the poor man to the garret, and knocked in the dark at the door of an attic. A voice replied, "Come in." It was Gribier's voice. Fauchelevent opened the door. The grave digger's dwelling was, like all such wretched habitations, an unfurnished and encumbered garret. A packing case, a coffin perhaps, took the place of a commode. A butter pot served for a drinking fountain. A straw mattress served for a bed. The floor served instead of tables and chairs. In a corner, on a tattered fragment which had been a piece of an old carpet, a thin woman and a number of children were piled in a heap. The whole of this poverty-stricken interior bore traces of having been overturned. One would have said that there had been an earthquake, for one. The covers were displaced, the rags scattered about, the jug broken, the mother had been crying, the children had probably been beaten. Traces of a vigorous and ill-tempered search. It was plain that the gravedigger had made a desperate search for his card, and had made everybody in the garret, from the jug to his wife, responsible for its loss. He wore an air of desperation. But Fauchelevent was in too great a hurry to terminate this adventure to take any notice of this sad side of his success. He entered and said, "I have brought you back your shovel and pick." Gribier gazed at him in stupefaction. "Is it you, peasant?" "And to-morrow morning you will find your card with the porter of the cemetery." And he laid the shovel and mattock on the floor. "What is the meaning of this?" demanded Gribier. "The meaning of it is that you dropped your card out of your pocket, that I found it on the ground after you were gone, that I have buried the corpse, that I have filled the grave, that I have done your work, that the porter will return your card to you, and that you will not have to pay 15 francs. There you have it, conscript." "Thanks, villager!" exclaimed Gribier, radiant. "The next time I will pay for the drinks." End of Book 8, Chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda McDaniel. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8. Cemeteries take that which is committed them. Chapter 8. A Successful Interrogatory. An hour later, in the darkness of night, 2 men and a child presented themselves at number 62 Rue Petit Picpus. The elder of the men lifted the knocker and rapped. They were Fauchelevent, Jean Valjean, and Cosette. The 2 old men had gone to fetch Cosette from the fruiterer's in the Rue du Chemin Vert, where Fauchelevent had deposited her on the preceding day. Cosette had passed these 24 hours trembling slightly and understanding nothing. She trembled to such a degree that she wept. She had neither eaten nor slept. The worthy fruit seller had plied her with 100 questions without obtaining any other reply than a melancholy and unvarying gaze. Cosette had betrayed nothing of what she had seen and heard during the last 2 days. She divined that they were passing through a crisis. She was deeply conscious that it was necessary to be good. Who has not experienced the sovereign power of those 2 words, pronounced with a certain accent in the ear of a terrified little being? Say nothing. Fear is mute. Moreover, no one guards a secret like a child. But when, at the expiration of these lugubrious 24 hours, she beheld Jean Valjean again, she gave vent to such a cry of joy that any thoughtful person who had chanced to hear that cry would have guessed that it issued from an abyss. Fauchelevent belonged to the convent and knew the passwords. All the doors opened. Thus was solved the double and alarming problem of how to get out and how to get in. The porter, who had received his instructions, opened the little servants' door which connected the courtyard with the garden, and which could still be seen from the street 20 years ago, in the wall at the bottom of the court which faced the carriage entrance. The porter admitted all 3 of them through this door, and from that point they reached the inner reserved parlor where Fauchelevent, on the preceding day, had received his orders from the prioress. The prioress, rosary in hand, was waiting for them. A vocal mother, with her veil lowered, stood beside her. A discreet candle lighted, one might almost say, made a show of lighting the parlor. The prioress passed Jean Valjean in review. There is nothing which examines like a downcast eye. Then she questioned him. "You are the brother?" "Yes, Reverend Mother," replied Fauchelevent. "What is your name?" Fauchelevent replied, "Ultime Fauchelevent." He really had had a brother named Ultime, who was dead. "Where do you come from?" Fauchelevent replied, "From Picquigny, near Amiens." "What is your age?" Fauchelevent replied, 50. What is your profession? Fauchelevent replied, gardener. Are you a good Christian? Fauchelevent replied, everyone is in the family. Is this your little girl? Fauchelevent replied, yes, Reverend Mother. You are her father? Fauchelevent replied, her grandfather. The vocal mother said to the prioress in a low voice, he answers well. Jean Valjean had not uttered a single word. The prioress looked attentively at Cosette and said half aloud to the vocal mother, she will grow up ugly. The two mothers consulted for a few moments in very low tones in the corner of the parlor. Then the prioress turned around and said, Father Fauvent, you will get another kneecap with a bell. 2 will be required now. And the following day, therefore, 2 bells were audible in the garden, and the nuns could not resist the temptation to raise the corner of their veils. At the extreme end of the garden, under the trees, 2 men, Fauvent and another man, were visible as they dug side by side, an enormous event. Their silence was broken to the extent of saying to each other, he is an assistant gardener. The vocal mothers added, he is a brother of Father Fauvent. Jean Valjean was, in fact, regularly installed. He had his belled kneecap, therefore he was official. His name was Ultime Fauchelevent. The most powerful determining cause of his admission had been the prioress's observation upon Cosette. She will grow up ugly. The prioress, that pronounced prognosticator, immediately took a fancy to Cosette and gave her a place in the school as a charity pupil. There is nothing that is not strictly logical about this. It is in vain that mirrors are banished from the convent. Women are conscious of their faces. Now, girls who are conscious of their beauty do not easily become nuns, the vocation being voluntary in inverse proportion to their good looks. More is to be hoped from the ugly than from the pretty. Hence a lively taste for plain girls. The whole of this adventure increased the importance of good old Fauchelevent. He won a triple success, in the eyes of Jean Valjean, whom he had saved and sheltered, in those of grave digger Gribier, who said to himself, he spared me that fine, with the convent, which being enabled, thanks to him, to retain the coffin of Mother Crucifixion under the altar, eluded Cæsar and satisfied God. There was a coffin containing a body in the Petit Picpus, and a coffin without a body in the Vaugirard cemetery. Public order had no doubt been deeply disturbed thereby, but no one was aware of it. As for the convent, its gratitude to Fauchelevent was very great. Fauchelevent became the best of servitors and the most precious of gardeners. Upon the occasion of the archbishop's next visit, the prioress recounted the affair to his grace, making something of a confession at the same time, and yet boasting of her deed. On leaving the convent, the archbishop mentioned it with approval, and in a whisper to Monsieur de Latil, Monsieur's confessor, afterwards Archbishop of Rheims and Cardinal. This admiration for Fauchelevent became widespread, for it made its way to Rome. We have seen a note addressed by the then reigning Pope Leo XII to one of his relatives, a Monsignor in the Nuncio's establishment in Paris, and bearing, like himself, the name of de la Ginga. It contained these lines: It appears that there is in a convent in Paris an excellent gardener, who is also a holy man, named Fauvent. Nothing of this triumph reached Fauchelevent in his hut. He went on grafting, weeding, and covering up his melon beds, without in the least suspecting his excellences and his sanctity. Neither did he suspect his glory, any more than a Durham or Surrey bull, whose portrait is published in the London Illustrated News, with this inscription, "Bull which carried off the prize at the cattle show." End of Book 8, Chapter 8. Read by Linda McDaniel, Atlanta, Georgia, December 2008.
Chapter 9 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book Eighth. Cemeteries take that which is committed them. Chapter 9. Cloistered. Cosette continued to hold her tongue in the convent. It was quite natural that Cosette should think herself Jean Valjean's daughter. Moreover, as she knew nothing, she could say nothing, and then she would not have said anything in any case. As we have just observed, nothing trains children to silence like unhappiness. Cosette had suffered so much that she feared everything, even to speak or to breathe. A single word had so often brought down an avalanche upon her. She had hardly begun to regain her confidence since she had been with Jean Valjean. She speedily became accustomed to the convent. Only she regretted Catherine, but she dared not say so. Once, however, she did say to Jean Valjean, "Father, if I had known, I would have brought her away with me." Cosette had been obliged, on becoming a scholar in the convent, to don the garb of the pupils of the house. Jean Valjean succeeded in getting them to restore to him the garments which she laid aside. This was the same mourning suit which he had made her put on when she had quitted the Thénardiers' inn. It was not very threadbare even now. Jean Valjean locked up these garments, plus the stockings and the shoes, with a quantity of camphor and all the aromatics in which convents abound, in a little valise which he found means of procuring. He set this valise on a chair near his bed, and he always carried the key about his person. "Father," Cosette asked him one day, "what is there in that box which smells so good?" Father Fauchelevent received other recompense for his good action, in addition to the glory which we just mentioned, and of which he knew nothing. In the first place, it made him happy. Next, he had much less work, since it was shared. Lastly, as he was very fond of snuff, he found the presence of M. Madeleine an advantage, in that he used 3 times as much as he had done previously, and that in an infinitely more luxurious manner, seeing that M. Madeleine paid for it. The nuns did not adopt the name of Ultime. They called Jean Valjean the other Fauvent. If these holy women had possessed anything of Javert's glance, they would eventually have noticed that when there was any errand to be done outside in the behalf of the garden, it was always the elder Fauchelevent, the old, the infirm, the lame man, who went, and never the other. But whether it is that eyes constantly fixed on God know not how to spy, or whether they were by preference occupied in keeping watch on each other, they paid no heed to this. Moreover, it was well for Jean Valjean that he kept close and did not stir out. Javert watched the quarter for more than a month. This convent was for Jean Valjean like an island surrounded by gulfs. Henceforth, those 4 walls constituted his world. He saw enough of the sky there to enable him to preserve his serenity, and Cosette enough to remain happy. A very sweet life began for him. He inhabited the old hut at the end of the garden, in company with Fauchelevent. This hovel, built of old rubbish, which was still in existence in 1845, was composed, as the reader already knows, of 3 chambers, all of which were utterly bare and had nothing beyond the walls. The principal one had been given up by force, for Jean Valjean had opposed it in vain, to M. Madeleine by Father Fauchelevent. The walls of this chamber had for ornament, in addition to the 2 nails whereon to hang the knee-cap and the basket, a royalist bank-note of 93, applied to the wall over the chimney-piece, and of which the following is an exact facsimile: Armée calbolique et royale, de par le roi, bon commerçable de 10 livres, pour objet fourni à l'armée, remboursable à la paix, série 3, numéro 10390. Stofflet. This specimen of Vendean paper money had been nailed to the wall by the preceding gardener, an old Chouan, who had died in the convent, and whose place Fauchelevent had taken. Jean Valjean worked in the garden every day, and made himself very useful. He had formerly been a pruner of trees, and he gladly found himself a gardener once more. It will be remembered that he knew all sorts of secrets and receipts for agriculture. He turned these to advantage. Almost all the trees in the orchard were ungrafted and wild. He budded them and made them produce excellent fruit. Cosette had permission to pass an hour with him every day. As the sisters were melancholy and he was kind, the child made comparisons and adored him. At the appointed hour she flew to the hut. When she entered the lowly cabin, she filled it with paradise. Jean Valjean blossomed out, and felt his happiness increase with the happiness which he afforded Cosette. The joy which we inspire has this charming property, that far from growing meagre, like all reflections, it returns to us more radiant than ever. At recreation hours Jean Valjean watched her running and playing in the distance, and he distinguished her laugh from that of the rest. For Cosette laughed now. Cosette's face had even undergone a change to a certain extent. The gloom had disappeared from it. A smile is the same as sunshine, it banishes winter from the human countenance. Recreation over, when Cosette went into the house again, Jean Valjean gazed at the windows of her classroom, and at night he rose to look at the windows of her dormitory. God has his own ways, moreover. The convent contributed, like Cosette, to uphold and complete the bishop's work in Jean Valjean. It is certain that virtue adjoins pride on one side. A bridge built by the devil exists there. Jean Valjean had been, unconsciously perhaps, tolerably near that side and that bridge, when Providence cast his lot in the convent of the Petit Picpus. So long as he had compared himself only to the bishop, he had regarded himself as unworthy, and had remained humble. But for some time past he had been comparing himself to men in general, and pride was beginning to spring up. Who knows? He might have ended by returning very gradually to hatred. The convent stopped him on that downward path. This was the second place of captivity which he had seen. In his youth, in what had been for him the beginning of his life, and later on, quite recently again, he had beheld another, a frightful place, a terrible place, whose severities had always appeared to him the iniquity of justice and the crime of the law. Now, after the galleys, he saw the cloister, and when he meditated how he had formed a part of the galleys, and that he now, so to speak, was a spectator of the cloister, he confronted the two in his own mind with anxiety. Sometimes he crossed his arms and leaned on his hoe, and slowly descended the endless spirals of reverie. He recalled his former companions, how wretched they were. They rose at dawn and toiled until night. Hardly were they permitted to sleep. They lay on camp beds, where nothing was tolerated but mattresses 2 inches thick, in rooms which were heated only in the very harshest months of the year. They were clothed in frightful red blouses. They were allowed, as a great favour, linen trousers in the hottest weather, and a woollen carter's blouse on their backs when it was very cold. They drank no wine and ate no meat, except when they went on fatigue duty. They lived nameless, designated only by numbers, and converted after a manner into ciphers themselves, with downcast eyes, with lowered voices, with shorn heads, beneath the cudgel and in disgrace. Then his mind reverted to the beings whom he had under his eyes. These beings also lived with shorn heads, with downcast eyes, with lowered voices, not in disgrace, but amid the scoffs of the world, not with their backs bruised with the cudgel, but with their shoulders lacerated with their discipline. Their names also had vanished from among men. They no longer existed except under austere appellations. They never ate meat, and they never drank wine. They often remained until evening without food. They were attired not in a red blouse, but in a black shroud of woollen, which was heavy in summer and thin in winter, without the power to add or subtract anything from it, without having even, according to the season, the resource of the linen garment or the woollen cloak. And for 6 months in the year they wore serge chemises, which gave them fever. They dwelt not in rooms warmed only during rigorous cold, but in cells where no fire was ever lighted. They slept, not on mattresses 2 inches thick, but on straw. And finally, they were not even allowed their sleep. Every night, after a day of toil, they were obliged, in the weariness of their first slumber, at the moment when they were falling sound asleep and beginning to get warm, to rouse themselves, to rise, and to go and pray in an ice-cold and gloomy chapel, with their knees on the stones. On certain days, each of these beings in turn had to remain for 12 successive hours in a kneeling posture, or prostrate, with face upon the pavement, and arms outstretched in the form of a cross. The others were men, these were women. What had those men done? They had stolen, violated, pillaged, murdered, assassinated. They were bandits, counterfeiters, poisoners, incendiaries, murderers, parricides. What had these women done? They had done nothing whatever. On the one hand, highway robbery, fraud, deceit, violence, sensuality, homicide, all sorts of sacrilege, every variety of crime. On the other, one thing only, innocence. Perfect innocence, almost caught up into heaven in a mysterious assumption, attached to the earth by virtue, already possessing something of heaven through holiness. On the one hand, confidences over crimes, which are exchanged in whispers; on the other, the confession of faults made aloud. And what crimes! And what faults! On the one hand, miasms; on the other, an ineffable perfume. On the one hand, a moral pest, guarded from sight, penned up under the range of cannon, and literally devouring its plague-stricken victims. On the other, the chaste flame of all souls on the same hearth. There darkness, here the shadow, but a shadow filled with gleams of light, and of gleams full of radiance. 2 strongholds of slavery, but in the first, deliverance possible, a legal limit always in sight, and then escape. In the second, perpetuity, the sole hope, at the distant extremity of the future, that faint light of liberty which men call death. In the first, men are bound only with chains; in the other, chained by faith. What flowed from the first? An immense curse, the gnashing of teeth, hatred, desperate viciousness, a cry of rage against human society, a sarcasm against heaven. What results flowed from the second? Blessings and love. And in these two places, so similar yet so unlike, these two species of beings, who were so very unlike, were undergoing the same work, expiation. Jean Valjean understood thoroughly the expiation of the former, that personal expiation, the expiation for one's self. But he did not understand that of these last, that of creatures without reproach and without stain, and he trembled as he asked himself, the expiation of what? What expiation? A voice within his conscience replied, the most divine of human generosities, the expiation for others. Here all personal theory is withheld. We are only the narrator. We place ourselves at Jean Valjean's point of view, and we translate his impressions. Before his eyes he had the sublime summit of abnegation, the highest possible pitch of virtue, the innocence which pardons men their faults, and which expiates in their stead. Servitude submitted to, torture accepted, punishment claimed by souls which have not sinned, for the sake of sparing it to souls which have fallen. The love of humanity swallowed up in the love of God, but even there preserving its distinct and mediatorial character. Sweet and feeble beings, possessing the misery of those who are punished, and the smile of those who are recompensed. And he remembered that he had dared to murmur. Often, in the middle of the night, he rose to listen to the grateful song of those innocent creatures, weighed down with severities, and the blood ran cold in his veins at the thought that those who were justly chastised raised their voices heavenward only in blasphemy, and that he, wretch that he was, had shaken his fist at God. There was one striking thing which caused him to meditate deeply, like a warning whisper from Providence itself. The scaling of that wall, the passing of those barriers, the adventure accepted even at the risk of death, the painful and difficult ascent, all those efforts even, which he had made to escape from that other place of expiation, he had made in order to gain entrance into this one. Was this a symbol of his destiny? This house was a prison likewise, and bore a melancholy resemblance to that other one whence he had fled. And yet he had never conceived an idea of anything similar. Again he beheld gratings, bolts, iron bars. To guard whom? Angels. These lofty walls which he had seen around tigers, he now beheld once more around lambs. This was a place of expiation and not of punishment, and yet it was still more austere, more gloomy, and more pitiless than the other. These virgins were even more heavily burdened than the convicts. A cold, harsh wind, that wind which had chilled his youth, traversed the barred and padlocked grating of the vultures. A still harsher and more biting breeze blew in the cage of these doves. Why? When he thought on these things, all that was within him was lost in amazement before this mystery of sublimity. In these meditations his pride vanished. He scrutinized his own heart in all manner of ways. He felt his pettiness, and many a time he wept. All that had entered into his life for the last 6 months had led him back towards the bishop's holy injunctions: Cosette through love, the convent through humility. Sometimes at eventide, in the twilight, at an hour when the garden was deserted, he could be seen on his knees in the middle of the walk which skirted the chapel, in front of the window through which he had gazed on the night of his arrival, and turned towards the spot where, as he knew, the sister was making reparation, prostrated in prayer. Thus he prayed as he knelt before the sister. It seemed as though he dared not kneel directly before God. Everything that surrounded him, that peaceful garden, those fragrant flowers, those children who uttered joyous cries, those grave and simple women, that silent cloister, slowly permeated him, and little by little his soul became compounded of silence like the cloister, of perfume like the flowers, of simplicity like the women, of joy like the children. And then he reflected that these had been 2 houses of God which had received him in succession at 2 critical moments in his life: the first when all doors were closed, and when human society rejected him; the second at a moment when human society had again set out in pursuit of him, and when the galleys were again yawning; and that, had it not been for the first, he should have relapsed into crime, and had it not been for the second, into torment. His whole heart melted in gratitude, and he loved more and more. Many years passed in this manner. Cosette was growing up. End of Book 8, Chapter 9, and end of Book 8. Recording by Ruth Golding. End of Les Misérables, Volume 2, Cosette, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood.